the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Simple logic dictates that this is symbolic. It's knowledge of good and evil typified as a tree. Why? Because the seed of the Word of God is planted in the heart of man, thereby producing a tree that is deeply rooted within our being. Since good and evil express behavior, then this tree denotes that which defines it. In part 2 of this series, we left off at the passages from Romans 7:7 through 12. Let's step through these to better understand the definition of good and evil. What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, "You shall not covet." Here, Paul discusses the law of God, stating that he would not have known sin if it had not been for the law. Knowing is knowledge, right? And knowledge of good and evil addresses behavior, does it not? So what's the first stage of our spiritual transition? The good stage beginning with innocence, our birth into this world. In this stage, we know nothing of good and evil or any need to address our behavior. But this soon changes. As for sin, Vine's dictionary defines this as a missing of the mark, while John wrote that sin is lawlessness. So when we talk about sin, we are talking about lawless behavior in any form and any degree. To reiterate, Paul said he would not have known sin or have knowledge of sin apart from the law. Now look at the next statement in Romans 7. But sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. Apart from the law, sin lies dead. Here we encounter a very interesting piece of the puzzle. Where there is no law, there is nothing to break or transgress. But when a law or commandment arises, then the opposite is true. Now, here's the part that challenges our thinking. The sin or lawless behavior Paul speaks of does not arise until a law or commandment is given. In other words, the law provokes the very thing it condemns. Tell little Jack not to spend his allowance on candy, and what does little Jack do? He walks just a little faster to the convenience store to get those sweet delights. No wonder the tree of knowledge is represented by a fruit tree. Everyone likes fruit. Yummy! In keeping with our perspective, Paul emphasizes his point. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin came alive, and I died. The very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. Apart from the law, Adam and Eve were living, innocent of any wrongdoing. But when the commandment came, sin came alive, and they died. The very commandment that promised life proved to be death to them. Death? Yes, which brings us to the following. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything as coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God, who has made us competent to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now, if the ministry of death, carved in letters on stone, came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of its glory, which was being brought to an end, will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, the ministry of righteousness must far exceed it in glory. Here, Paul contrasts the difference between the Old Covenant law and the New Covenant promise, calling the Old Covenant law the letter that kills. The letter would be knowledge of good and evil, would it not? It would, but Paul said knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. Puffs up, as in pride? Interesting. Paul even calls the law the ministry of death and condemnation, as opposed to the ministry of the Spirit and righteousness. The ministry of death? The ministry of condemnation? So why does the tree of knowledge possess both good and evil? Because the same knowledge that promotes the good is the same knowledge that provokes its opposite. One garden, two trees. One principle of sowing and reaping, two outcomes. One law, two different results. Friend, it was God who planted the garden and put man in it. It was God who designed the principle of sowing and reaping that is responsible for all that exists, both visible and invisible. And it was God who gave Adam the commandment and Israel the law. Sin and death did not enter this world because some fallen angel tricked us into rebelling against our Maker. Paul was clear. It was sin which seized an opportunity through the commandment. It was sin that deceived us. It was sin that killed us. But what about the serpent? How does he fit in? You mean that crafty little bugger that just seems to show up out of nowhere? Let me remind you. The garden, trees, sowing, reaping, and the law are all inward, just as Jesus taught. So might that sneaky little fella called the serpent apply to something inward that keeps screwing everything up? You know, Mr. Pride? I know I sound like a broken record, but I can't help myself. I have been convinced for some time now that pride, our love for the self, is the real issue. If Satan is a spirit, then he's the haughty spirit in Proverbs 16:18. If Paul said that it was sin or our lawless behavior that deceived and killed us, then that's what it was. If it had been the devil, wouldn't he have just said that instead? Hope I haven't gotten myself into trouble for challenging one of the biggest beliefs on the planet. If we don't have the devil to blame, then who are we gonna blame? Maybe it's time we own up to our responsibilities instead of blaming and accusing everyone but ourselves. First good, then evil, the opposite of live. The seed is alive before it's planted, but once it falls into the ground, it begins the process of dying and death. Not because God is angry, but because our Creator has a unique purpose in mind. And what is that purpose? What else would it be if not life? That's it for this study, but be sure to join me for the next as we take a look at the bad good. Thanks to everyone who listens, subscribes, and comments. I sincerely appreciate all of you.